March 1945. A cold wind sweeps across the temporary American POW processing station set up on the outskirts of Remagen. The distant thud of artillery has faded now, replaced by the steady hum of truck engines and the metallic clatter of equipment being unloaded. Dozens of captured German auxiliaries, women taken during the rapid American advance along the Rhine, stand in a narrow line, their uniforms dusty, their faces pale with exhaustion and uncertainty. Most stare at the ground. A few glance nervously at the guards. None speak. Then footsteps approach, light, quick, deliberate. An American officer emerges from a canvas-topped command truck. She wears a crisp WSC uniform, her cap neatly aligned, her expression calm, yet unmistakably authoritative. Several male soldiers straighten as she passes. One hands her a clipboard. She nods and immediately begins issuing instructions. Her voice carries across the courtyard, firm, unhesitating. Men respond instantly, shifting positions, reorganizing the line, preparing medical checks. The German women lift their eyes, first in confusion, then disbelief, then silent shock. For many, this is the first time they have ever seen a woman command men in a military setting, an image utterly incompatible with the world they came from. And it is this quiet, jarring moment that leads us into the larger story of how two completely different wartime cultures collided. The scene at Remagen did not emerge from a vacuum. By early 1945, the world was witnessing the final unraveling of the Third Reich. Germany's armies were collapsing on every front, its cities in ruins, and its military structure under unprecedented strain. Yet even as the war forced dramatic changes across society, one principle had remained almost untouched inside Nazi ideology. Women were not to command men. From the earliest years of the regime, German gender policy had been rigid and deeply ideological. Women were celebrated primarily as mothers, homemakers, and supporters of the nation's future population. Their purpose was to serve the state through family, not through authority. Even when the war intensified and millions of men were drafted into frontline service, the German military establishment resisted placing women in positions that resembled command. German women did serve. They worked as signal auxiliaries, clerks, radio operators, nurses, typists, and anti-aircraft support personnel. Some operated searchlights. Others helped coordinate air defense networks. Many serve in the Reich Labor Service or various paramilitary branches, such as the Luftwaffe's female communications teams. But no matter their technical proficiency or dedication, the hierarchy remained immovable. They could assist, but they could not command. By contrast, across the Atlantic, the United States had taken a different path long before the war reached its peak. American military planners, facing global commitments that stretched across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, recognized early that women would be essential to sustaining operations. The Women's Army Corps, WAC, created in 1942, marked a profound shift. For the first time in U.S. history, women were formally integrated into the Army structure, not merely as volunteers or aides, but as uniformed service members with defined responsibilities, ranks, and authority. They managed communications networks, supervised supply depots, oversaw transportation systems, and coordinated large-scale logistics. In positions where technical competence mattered more than physical combat capability, many held supervisory authority over male enlisted personnel. Regulations made the chain of command clear. Rank determined authority, not gender. And in an expanding, modernizing military machine, women rose quickly based on performance. By 1944, similar patterns appeared in the Navy's WAVES program and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. American women ran motor pools, directed aircraft control operations, managed intelligence filing systems, oversaw administrative detachments, and controlled portions of POW camp documentation chains. In many wartime facilities, It became entirely ordinary to see a female officer issuing instructions to male soldiers who executed the orders without hesitation. This underlying difference in gender policy set the stage for one of the most quietly revealing cultural collisions of the war. When American forces surged into Germany in 1944 to 45, they rapidly captured numerous clerks, communications personnel, and air defense auxiliaries, including women. These POWs entered a military environment that was alien to everything their own institutions had taught them. What they witnessed, women wearing uniforms that symbolized authority, issuing directives in a manner taken seriously by male troops, was more than a novelty. It was a fundamental challenge to their worldview. For Americans, the presence of women in command roles within administrative, logistical, and medical operations was practical, necessary, and increasingly normalized. 4 German female auxiliaries, raised in a system where women were expected to be deferential and politically silent, the sight appeared almost surreal. Rumors had reached them, stories that the Allies employed women in all sorts of positions, but few had truly believed it. Most dismissed such accounts as propaganda, exaggeration, or misunderstandings. Nothing in their personal experience had prepared them for the reality. By March 1945, with the Rhine crossing and the American drive into central Germany accelerating, POW camps and field processing stations became the first points where many captured women saw these differences firsthand. Rows of tents, wooden watchtowers, trucks arriving with new prisoners. These were the expected elements. But the administrative hubs, run with efficiency and discipline, often had women at their center. Officers with authority, corporals checking identification papers, lieutenants supervising medical inspections or ration distribution. This contrast between 2 military cultures, one rigidly hierarchical by gender, the other increasingly flexible, was the backdrop against which stunned reactions unfolded. And it is within this historical environment, shaped by ideology, necessity, and wartime evolution, that the moment of cultural collision gains its full meaning. The foundation is set, and the stage is prepared for examining how these 2 worlds confronted each other during captivity, shaping not just the POWs experiences, but their understanding of power, equality, and defeat. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany in 1945, the sheer volume of prisoners grew beyond anything Allied planners had predicted. Entire auxiliary detachments, clerical staffs, Luftwaffe communications units, and anti-aircraft support crews were captured in clusters. Many of them women who had been stationed near airfields, command posts, or communication hubs. These prisoners were funneled toward field processing stations before being transferred to larger, more permanent camps. Each station followed a consistent procedure: identification, medical inspection, separation by category, interrogation if needed, and assignment to transport columns. The process demanded speed and precision. American doctrine emphasized order and efficiency, and it was here that women of the Women's Army Corps often held administrative command roles. Their authority was not decorative, it was operational. Many WAC officers had spent years training in communications management, record-keeping systems, transportation coordination, or cryptographic support. They understood documentation structures as deeply as any staff officer. In POW operations, where thousands passed through in a matter of days, these skills were indispensable. Women organized the files, directed male clerks and guards, supervised inventory of personal items, and managed the scheduling of transports to long-term holding camps in France or Belgium. 4 German female auxiliaries now entering this environment, the first shock was visual. American women wore tailored uniforms with crisp insignia indicating rank: lieutenants, captains, sergeants, corporals. In the Reich, women could wear uniforms, but rarely insignia indicating superior authority. Even the Luftwaffe's female personnel, though formally part of the Air Force structure, held no military rank equivalent to men. Their badges reflected specialty roles, not command positions. Thus, when a WAC lieutenant approached a group of male soldiers and issued a directive, reassign these prisoners to the second column, begin medical checks on the new arrivals, prepare the transport list, the efficiency with which those orders were carried out appeared almost unreal to the POWs. In their world, such obedience toward a woman in uniform was unthinkable. American regulations made the distinction clear. WAC officers outranked male enlisted troops, and their authority was backed by military law. The system functioned because it had been built on necessity rather than ideology. The U.S. military had embraced the principle that skill and competence determined position. Gender was secondary to performance. By 1945, many women were supervising complex logistical operations, commanding offices of dozens, and ensuring that the machinery of the Army moved without interruption. Inside the POW camps themselves, this structure continued. Large camps were typically overseen by male officers, but administrative branches, records supply, medical triage, and clerical operations frequently included WAC personnel. Some camps had women leading entire documentation sections. Others had female sergeants supervising male guards responsible for escorting prisoners to work details or medical stations. These roles were not symbolic. They were critical components of the detention system. American policy also ensured that POWs were treated according to the Geneva Convention. This meant that German women, who in many cases had been trained in environments emphasizing strict subordination and emotional distance, suddenly found themselves in a system that blended discipline with procedural fairness. The combination was disorienting. Everything, the tone, the efficiency, the chain of command, reflected a different worldview. Reports from U.S. Army units noted recurring reactions: confusion, whispered disbelief, stunned silence. Some POWs assumed at first that the female officers were exceptions, rare anomalies rather than part of a broader structure. Only after days or weeks in custody did the full picture become clear. This was a normal feature of American military organization. It was not propaganda, not a temporary wartime measure, and not a symbolic gesture. It was how their captors operated. For younger auxiliaries raised during the height of Nazi ideology, the sight carried additional weight. They had been taught that the National Socialist model of society was superior, efficient, morally grounded, and destined to prevail. Seeing the enemy function with a level of calm competence and gender flexibility unfamiliar to them forced many to confront uncomfortable questions about the future, questions intensified by the reality of defeat. Furthermore, the American approach reflected broader democratic principles that contrasted sharply with the hierarchical, male-dominated structure of the Reich. Whereas Nazi ideology proclaimed rigid distinctions and strict roles, the American system relied more heavily on adaptability, civil-military cooperation, and pragmatic use of available talent. Women were recruited, trained, and promoted because the war demanded it, and because many proved remarkably capable. It was within this environment that the encounters between captured German women and American female officers gained significance. Each moment of astonished silence, each hesitant glance, each whispered comment among POWs was shaped by the vast historical forces behind the scenes: ideological education, social tradition, military necessity, and national identity. And as these women were led deeper into the camp structures, into the heart of administrative centers run with American precision, the shock intensified, setting the stage for the deeper angles and perspectives that would define their experience in captivity. For the captured German auxiliaries, the first hours after arrival in an American processing station were marked by exhaustion and fear, but also by the slow, dawning realization that the world beyond the Reich operated on rules they had never imagined. Many of these women had grown up under a system that defined gender roles with absolute certainty. Authority came from men. Orders came from men. Discipline came from men. Women served, supported, assisted, never commanded. So when they witnessed an American female lieutenant calmly directing male guards, something inside them faltered. The moment did not provoke open debate or a loud reaction. Instead, it produced a quiet, visceral jolt, a tightening at the throat, a hard swallow, a stunned expression passing from one POW to another. Some looked away quickly, as if unsure whether staring would be interpreted as defiance. Others exchanged discreet glances, searching for confirmation that they were seeing the same thing. The most striking part was the normality with which it occurred. No one around the American officer seemed surprised. The men under her command responded briskly and without hesitation. The camp continued its routine. This normalcy made the shock deeper. It signaled that these women in uniform were not extraordinary figures. They were simply part of the military system of their captors. For many POWs, it was the moment they first understood that their surrender brought them not only into a foreign nation's custody, but into an entirely different social order, one that would challenge everything they believed about hierarchy, gender, and power. The confrontation between German POWs and American women officers was more than a military interaction. It was a cultural collision decades in the making. In the Third Reich, gender ideology was not simply a social expectation. It was a political doctrine. Nazi propaganda had shaped public understanding for childhood. Women were encouraged toward domestic roles, motherhood, and community service. Even when war forced the regime to expand women's participation, these duties were framed as extensions of feminine responsibility, not steps toward institutional authority. In the United States, however, the war accelerated a shift already underway. American women had entered factories, shipyards, and administrative agencies in massive numbers. Female engineers, pilots, mathematicians, and communication specialists already operated within civilian sectors. When the military opened auxiliary branches like the WAC and waves, the transition into uniformed authority, though still limited, felt natural and pragmatic to most Americans. This divergence shaped how each side interpreted the other. To German POWs, the sight of American women in command roles suggested disorder, abnormality, even moral decay, ideas reinforced by years of ideological conditioning. To Americans, it represented simply another facet of wartime mobilization, an efficient use of talent when manpower was stretched across two oceans. The cultural gap was so wide, and the German indoctrination so deeply rooted, that many POWs assumed the American women were temporary stand-ins, filling roles only because too many men had been lost in battle. Only later, through observation and conversation, did they realize that these were trained officers whose authority was recognized across the U.S. Army structure. This gap in worldview formed the emotional and intellectual backdrop of their captivity, influencing every interaction to come. The first perspectives reveal the emotional and cultural layers behind the POW shock. The next angles will move deeper into the organizational and operational realities that shaped these encounters. How American women actually managed and commanded within the complex machinery of wartime administration. The administrative machinery of a World War II POW operation was immense. Tens of thousands of prisoners passing through temporary and permanent camps, each requiring documentation, classification, medical screening, and transport management. In this environment, authority was not symbolic. It was essential to maintaining discipline and preventing confusion. American women, especially within the Women's Army Corps, had earned their roles through training, technical skill, and proven administrative competence. When a WAC lieutenant or sergeant stepped into an operations tent, she did so with the full support of the command structure. Her orders carried the backing of Army regulations and the expectation of immediate compliance. Assigning guards, directing prisoner movements, verifying transport manifests, or cross-checking interrogation schedules were routine tasks. Yet each required clear leadership. German female POWs watching this process noticed the structure first. They saw women coordinating shifts, inspecting paperwork, and questioning inconsistencies in reports. They heard them communicating directly with male NCOs, adjusting schedules, or requesting additional personnel. To the Americans, this was a mundane display of workflow management. To the Germans, it defied every military convention they had been taught. The efficiency with which the mixed-gender teams functioned further emphasized the contrast. American soldiers rarely hesitated when responding to female officers, and disagreements, when they occurred, were resolved through procedure, not gendered expectations. This unwavering acceptance of women's authority revealed an organizational culture that prioritized function over ideology. To the POWs, it demonstrated a military system operating on principles unfamiliar to them, a chain of command determined by rank, experience, and responsibility, not by gender. The Second World War was fought not only on battlefields, but across vast networks of communication lines, logistical chains, and administrative systems. Many of these systems, signal networks, transportation hubs, and documentation centers, relied heavily on speed and accuracy. American women, especially those trained in cryptographic work, communications routing, clerical management, and transport coordination, played vital roles in sustaining these networks. In POW operations, the presence of female officers reflected this broader technological capability. Many have been trained on punch card systems, teleprinter networks, and advanced communication protocols that helped synchronize camp operations with higher commands. Their ability to process data quickly, reconcile conflicting reports, or identify errors in prisoner records made them central to the operational rhythm. German POWs saw them operating typewriters with remarkable speed, reviewing documents with practiced precision, and issuing orders that ensured the smooth movement of hundreds of prisoners at a time. To women who had worked as Luftwaffe communications auxiliaries, the technical aspects were familiar, but the authority attached to them was not. In Germany, technical skill did not convert into command authority for women. In the American system, however, competence directly reinforced leadership. A WAC officer overseeing an administrative center was expected to manage male enlisted personnel because she possessed the training required to keep the system functioning. This difference came into sharp focus during transport operations, where American women often supervised the preparation of convoy rosters and coordinated with male military police units. The sight of a woman overseeing a group of armed guards while controlling the pace and order of prisoner movements was among the most striking images the POWs encountered. To the Americans, this was simply operational efficiency. To the POWs, it was a technological and organizational reality that challenged everything they had believed about gender, authority, and capability. By late March 1945, the American advance had overrun several communication hubs and Luftwaffe auxiliary stations near the Central Rhine corridor. Among the prisoners taken during these operations were groups of female signal auxiliaries, trained, disciplined, and accustomed to strict hierarchical order. They had served in structured environments where every instruction flowed downward from male officers, and where women's responsibilities, however technical, were carefully confined to support roles. Their transport convoy arrived at a larger American-controlled transit camp positioned inside an abandoned rail depot. Wooden platforms, barbed wire boundaries, and rows of canvas tents filled the sprawling complex. The constant movement, trucks unloading prisoners, guards directing columns, clerks recording serial numbers, created a rhythm that felt more like a logistical center than a battlefield site. The German women stepped down from the trucks, expecting the standard procedures they had heard about, searching, documentation, separation, and processing. But what awaited them was a moment that would anchor itself in their memories for decades. At the center of the platform stood an American operations table manned by 3 soldiers, 2 male corporals and 1 female first lieutenant. She wore the insignia of the Women's Army Corps, her uniform immaculate despite the dust in the air. A sidearm rested at her hip, not for combat use, but because officers supervising prisoner movements were required to carry one. Papers were clipped to a board at her side. A field telephone hung from a post to her right. She was clearly in charge. Male enlisted soldiers waited for her signal before moving the next column forward. The German auxiliaries paused involuntarily. Some blinked hard. Others simply stared. One woman, a communications specialist barely 20 years old, instinctively lowered her eyes, assuming the American officer was accompanying a male superior. Only when the lieutenant began issuing brisk instructions, direct, unhesitating, and clearly authoritative, did the realization set in. She was the superior. The sequence unfolded with mechanical precision. "Next group, advance to Station 2, the lieutenant ordered. The 2 corporals immediately repositioned themselves, guiding the prisoners forward. Another guard approached with a clipboard, waiting as the lieutenant cross-checked names and categories. When he hesitated on a misread surname, she corrected him sharply, not unkindly, but with unmistakable authority. He nodded, made the adjustment, and continued. The German POWs watched as the men responded to her instructions with the same discipline they would show any male officer. No awkwardness, no hesitation, no symbolic courtesy, just clear execution of orders. For the German women, the moment was profoundly disorienting. Their entire professional world had been defined by male command. Even in their most skilled environments, radio networks, air defense control rooms, and field communications, women existed within boundaries designed to maintain ideological clarity. Authority belonged to men by definition, tradition, and propaganda. Here, that foundation cracked. As their line advanced, another scene intensified the shock. A second group of American personnel approached the operations table, a senior male sergeant and 2 military police privates. The sergeant gave the lieutenant a respectful nod, waited for her acknowledgement, and then stood silently while she reviewed the transport instructions he carried. Only after she approved the details and signed a form did the sergeant proceed with his duties. For the POWs, the sight of a male NCO waiting for a woman's authorization was the final confirmation that they were witnessing a system entirely unlike their own. One of the German women later recounted that in the Luftwaffe auxiliaries, even the most technically skilled female specialists could never have imagined instructing a male under-officer. The indoctrination had been too strong, the boundaries too rigid. Many have been taught explicitly that allowing women to command men would undermine discipline, weaken military morale, and destabilize the social order. Yet here, on the platform of a POW transit camp, American discipline seemed entirely intact. Men followed female officers without question. Order prevailed. The system worked. The shock escalated as the prisoners were guided through the next station, equipment inventory, where another WC sergeant supervised male soldiers collecting and cataloging confiscated items. When one guard attempted to speed the process, the sergeant corrected him, emphasizing accuracy over haste. He adjusted his behavior immediately, demonstrating the chain of command in its simplest form. For the German women, each interaction reinforced the same realization. Competence was respected here, rank was enforced here, and gender did not alter authority. The emotional impact deepened with every step they took. The ideological frameworks they had internalized since adolescence, through education, propaganda, and everyday life, no longer aligned with the reality before them. And as the prisoners moved toward the medical inspection station, the culmination of their disbelief approached setting the stage for the decisive moment when the contrast between two wartime cultures became impossible to reconcile. The interrogator gently slid the last photograph across the wooden table. This one was different. Not of pilots, not of American crews, but of an entire squadron of women lined up beside their aircraft, their flight suits dusty, their expressions calm and confident. The German women leaned in. Their eyes widened, not in shock this time, but in something deeper, something that came dangerously close to admiration. One of the older POWs, a woman who had served as a postal auxiliary in the Reich's Communication Corps, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. She whispered, "They are officers." The interrogator nodded again. Not a word was spoken for several long seconds. A younger POW, barely in her early 20s, with blonde hair tied back in a simple braid, reached out and ran her fingers lightly over the image, as if trying to absorb its reality through touch. Her voice cracked. We were told women were too weak, too emotional, too inferior. Another woman, one who had always kept a stoic front, gave a dry laugh, short, bitter, and filled with decades of forced conformity. Inferior? Look at them. They look like they command the sky. The hut seemed to shrink around them as the weight of the moment settled on their shoulders. Outside, an American Jeep rumbled past. Boots crunched on gravel. The distant clang of a mess tin echoed through the camp. But inside, history was being rewritten inside the minds of these women, and they could feel it. For the first time, they saw the truth. The Reich had not just lied to them. It had limited them, crippled them, denied them a world they were perfectly capable of standing in. One woman suddenly pushed her chair back and stood up. Her eyes were wet, not with fear, but with anger. Not at the Americans, but at her own government. All our lives, she said softly, they told us our only purpose was to serve men. They told us our place was in the home, at the typewriter, behind the lines. She pointed toward the photograph. But these women, they fly machines faster than anything we've ever seen. They fight. They are honored. Silence followed. A silence so profound it felt like the closing chapter of a book none of them realized they had been trapped inside. And then, almost impossibly, one of the women smiled. A small, sad smile, but a free one. It was the first expression of hope they had shown since their capture. In that dim hut, still smelling of paper, dust, and fatigue, the German women POWs came face to face with a reality that destroyed everything the Nazi ideology had built in them. But in that destruction, there was liberation, a liberation they never knew they needed, until the photographs showed them what the world looked like without chains. When the photographs were finally gathered and the session came to an end, the German women did not rise immediately. They sat quietly, staring at the tabletop, each lost in her own storm of thoughts. The interrogator stepped out of the hut, leaving them alone, not out of carelessness, but because he understood something important. Revelations don't settle instantly. They echo. They rearrange. They take root. Outside, the late afternoon sun drifted behind the barbed wire fence, casting long shadows that stretched across the camp like the fading remnants of a collapsing world. American guards walked their usual routes. The smell of soup from the mess hall drifted on the breeze. It was an ordinary day, but inside the hut, nothing felt ordinary to the women anymore. One of them, the same one who had defiantly refused to speak during previous interrogations, rubbed her hands together, staring at the cracks in the wooden floorboards. "If this is true," she murmured, "then everything we believed was manufactured." Another woman nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They kept us small, so we would never question them." For the first time since their capture, the conversations among the POWs were not about food, conditions, rumors of battles, or worries about their families. They were about possibilities. What might we have become? Why were we never allowed to try? What else did they hide from us? Questions, dangerous questions in the Reich. now flowed freely. Outside, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing roll call. The women stood up, but their movements were different, less mechanical, more thoughtful. As they walked out into the yard, the American interpreters watching them noticed something subtle. Their posture had changed. Not straighter, not proud, but loosened, as if an invisible weight had been unhooked from their shoulders. They were still prisoners, still facing uncertainty, still far from home, but their minds were no longer confined. Later that night, as the women sat on their bunks wrapped in army-issued blankets, the conversations continued in whispers. Some clutched the edges of their blankets tightly, thinking of daughters or sisters back home, girls who would grow up under a system that never believed in them. Some stared at the ceiling, imagining the American pilots in their flight suits, stepping into cockpits with confidence and purpose. And some, quietly, painfully began to grieve, not for the war, not for the defeat, but for the years of potential stolen from them by ideology. For the first time, the war felt truly over. Not because Germany was collapsing, but because the illusion that held them captive mentally had been broken. In that silent, dim barracks, they were no longer just prisoners of the Allies. They were becoming free from the Reich itself. In the weeks following their arrival at American camps, the German female POWs were assigned to routine tasks: inventory management, medical screenings, food distribution, and clerical work. While these were basic assignments, the environment in which they worked subtly reinforced the lessons from that first confrontation with American women in authority. The camps functioned efficiently, strictly adhering to military order. But now that order was visibly led by women who commanded respect through competence and authority, not ideology or intimidation. Reports from camp officers describe recurring patterns among the POWs. Many became more attentive, asking questions, observing protocols, and showing interest in procedures they had once performed only under male supervision. Some began mimicking the organizational behaviors they saw, double-checking records, maintaining clearer logs, and taking initiative within the constraints allowed. It was as if the encounter had not only shaken their worldview, but had also planted the seeds of practical learning, an adaptation born from respect rather than coercion. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Older POWs, who had been deeply indoctrinated into Nazi gender norms, expressed astonishment at their own evolving perceptions. Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal moments of quiet reflection, realizations that women could lead effectively, that skill could transcend gender, and that societal constructs were not immutable. Some acknowledged feelings of shame at having internalized propaganda that undervalued their own capabilities. Others recorded a budding sense of hope that women in Germany could claim authority once the war ended. For the Americans, these reactions were subtle but unmistakable. Officers observed that morale and cooperation among POWs improved when tasks were delegated under female supervision. Discipline was maintained more effectively than some predicted, suggesting that competence and fairness often outweighed cultural biases. The encounters also provided the Allies with insights into the social conditioning of the Axis population, how deeply gender ideology had permeated daily life, and how exposure to different social models could challenge entrenched beliefs. At a broader level, these experiences foreshadowed the post-war reconstruction of German society. Women returning home after captivity carried with them memories of authority exercised competently by their captors, and in some cases, their behavior during internment subtly influenced local communities. In interviews conducted years later, former POWs recalled the shock of witnessing American women commanding men as one of the earliest lessons in questioning the rigid structures of the Third Reich. This mental shift, occurring in the controlled microcosm of a POW camp, exemplified the broader cultural and ideological reorientation Germany would confront in the post-war period. By the time liberation and repatriation commenced, the German women carried more than physical survival. They carried a quietly revolutionary understanding. Authority was not inherently male, competence transcended gender, and societal hierarchies were neither permanent nor absolute. The POW camps had unintentionally become laboratories for social education, teaching lessons that the battlefield alone could never convey. The story of the German female POWs confronted by American women in command is, at its heart, a story of revelation. It is a quiet, profound testament to how the structures of war can unexpectedly confront the rigid ideologies of society. For these women, the battlefield had already been lost, but it was within the confines of camp, amid paperwork, medical inspections, and transport logistics, that a deeper victory occurred, the shattering of assumptions, the unlearning of a lifetime of indoctrination. In watching American women issue orders to men, direct operations with confidence, and maintain discipline without intimidation, the POWs were forced to confront a reality that the Reich had never allowed them to imagine. Authority, competence, and respect were not bound by gender. Skill and training, not propaganda or tradition, determined leadership. The shock they felt was more than surprise. It was a reorientation of their worldview, a quiet upheaval that challenged the very foundations of the society in which they had been raised. This moment also illuminates a broader truth about warfare and human adaptability. The outcomes of battles are often measured in territory, casualties, and material loss, but some of the most enduring transformations occur in the mind. The camp became, unintentionally, a place where rigid hierarchies could be questioned, where capability could override convention, and where a generation of women glimpsed the possibilities of equality, even amid defeat. The encounter leaves a lasting legacy, not only for the women who witnessed it, but for the history of military organization itself. It underscores the importance of merit over ideology, the power of example, and the subtle but profound ways in which exposure to alternative models can reshape belief systems. Ultimately, the story is a reflection on humanity's capacity for growth, even in the aftermath of destruction. It reminds us that change often begins in small, unforeseen moments. A lieutenant's calm command, a photograph of pilots defying expectation, or the quiet realization that one's assumptions about the world were, in fact, limited. These were the victories that transcended borders and battlefields, transforming not just prisoners, but the very understanding of what is possible. This reflection closes the journey, revealing how authority, competence, and courage can reshape minds, long after the guns have fallen silent.